Welcome. In this video, we will be once again taking a deep dive into the mechanics of the EVE Online Relic and data hacking minigame. To be precise, we'll be taking a look at mid spawns. Now, I still don't have an intro. That's acceptable, right? Now, this video is a sequel to the data and relic hacking guide that I did earlier. So if you haven't watched that video, absolutely do watch that video first, because this one will make a lot more sense after that. Before we can talk about the mechanics of mid-spawn, we need to get on the same page as to what a mid-spawn is. What I want to make very clear is that a mid-spawn is a mid-spawn, not because you spawn in the middle, but because the core is too close. What normally happens is that the core is at least 8 nodes away. Sometimes that is not the case. And in those cases, because the core is not 8 nodes away, this is what we'll call a mid-spawn. I also have to quickly talk about the data because I have new data. I was in a conversation with someone on Reddit, and they just dropped that they had like this special club where you could only join if you had a screenshot of a hack where the first node you clicked was the core. So a one-click win, and then you'd be allowed into that forum section or something like that. Now, when I heard that, my first reaction was, that's amazing, because that means you have screenshots of mid-spawns, and they're very rare. And it turns out they had 42 screenshots, which they shared with me. I'm very grateful for that. So big shout out to them. Now, this is the most typical of typical mid-spawns. The spawn is dead center, and the core is very close. So this is obviously, by any stretch of the imagination, a mid-spawn. And it's also quite easy to see why this has to be a mid-spawn, because if we look at the distance between where the players spawn and the other nodes, we can see that the maximum distance is 7, and the core requires a distance of 8 to spawn, as we have seen. So this means that the core couldn't spawn anywhere. Literally, it couldn't spawn anywhere outside of that 8 range. And instead, the game decided to just put the core randomly anywhere. So this is the general idea that led me to the first theory I had about mid-spawns. And that is that if there is no nodes, at least 8 away from the player, the core will be spawned in randomly. Now, this would be a great rule, and it is true, but there is exceptions to the rule in the sense that there are other spawns where the core is also spawned in randomly. So let's take a look at one of those. Now, this is one of my own hacks, actually. And as you can see, the core is close again, so this is definitely mid-spawn. However, there is also a single node here where the core could have spawned. So we have to do something to incorporate that into the theory. So one of my first theories was, well, maybe just one node isn't enough, and it needs like 2 nodes together, for example. So, well, let's try and test that theory. And, well, this one's quickly debunked just by looking at this hack, where we can see that even though the game only had exactly 1 node to put the core in over here, right? It still put it there. It had no problems doing that. So this alteration to the theory doesn't work. So what else can we come up with? Well, looking at this hack, maybe this one node where the core could have spawned was already occupied. For example, by a white node or a utility system or defense system. Now, this is actually my leading theory, even though I don't really have any data to either support it or debunk it. And I want to explain why I don't have that data. Now, imagine that you are in your Heron and you're doing this hack. Well, if you find a core very close, which is true for all the signal cartel data, and well, the one hack that I also did, you're not going to look around in the map and find what's in literally the farthest away corner. So nobody who has found a core very close to them has actually looked in the corners, or I don't have that data. So that's why I don't have the data, and I would love to hear your guys' theories about what exactly happens here, why else those nodes couldn't be eligible, or if you think the whole theory doesn't work out, and also if you have data for me. Now, even without this data, I was actually feeling quite comfortable about this whole theory until I took another look at the Eve cartel data, and it forced me to really rethink a lot of what I already did. So here we have this hack, and this immediately caught my eye for two reasons. First of all, and I think that's the most obvious one, this is not the middle. So if we draw the arrows from here, what you'll see is that there's actually quite a spacious area for the core to spawn in. So we start here and we draw it out 7 nodes, and we actually see that there's 9 nodes here where the core could have spawned. Why didn't the game spawn the core there? Now, the second thing that is weird about this hack is that if we take a look at where the player spawned, we can see that it is a 6 connectivity node. It's connected to 6 other nodes. And I had never seen that in my 100 hacks that I did for the Relic and Data Hacking Guide. I'd never spawned in a node with more than 2 connections. And that really made me look into the amount of connections that I had when I spawned. And I noticed that 2/3 of them, actually majority, was where I spawned in a 1 connection node, and that another third was where I spawned in a 2 connection node. And I asked myself, why is it that the 1 connection node is favored so much? Because it wasn't something I was necessarily expecting. And I noticed that there was never a case where I spawned in a 2 connection node when there was a 1 connection node available. And I think that means that the game will always put you in a 1 connection node if it's available. Something else I started to see is that 2 connection nodes are actually quite rare. And they exist mostly in corners. And well, they're already quite rare. They exist in corners. And when they don't exist in the corners, their connections are not adjacent to each other. So here we have a 2 connection node, which is not in a corner. And the connections go to 2 ways. And I have one hack where this isn't the case, and we have a 2 connection node where the connections are adjacent to each other. So going back to this hack, I think we can now understand what happened here. If we look at the map here, we can see that there really isn't anywhere for the game to spawn the player. There's no 1 connection node, there's no 2 connection node. And thus what it did is it spawned the player randomly, and then the core as well, randomly. So to recap everything and to really add everything up, I think this is how the spawning process works. So first off, the game tries to spawn the player in a 1 connection node, and then it tries to put the core 8 away from the player. And usually it succeeds at that because the map generation favors 1 connection nodes that are close to a wall or even in a corner, which that means that there is space on the other side of the map to put the core there. Now, sometimes the player is stuck in the middle of the map, and that really cuts down on the amount of eligible nodes. And, well, then the core spawning isn't successful, and the core is just spawned anywhere on the map. And note that this is where that little bit of uncertainty is still in here, where we don't really know what constitutes an ineligible node, and we should be looking for more data here. Now, when there is no 1 connection node available on the map, The game then attempts to spawn a player in a 2-connection node. And we have seen that the map generation seems to absolutely hate to put 2-connection nodes in the middle of the map. So naturally, these don't very often give you a mid spawn, because if they're on the sides, then again there is enough space on the other side of the map. However, we think that if there would be a 2-connection node in the middle of the map and a player would spawn there, and the core wouldn't be really able to spawn anywhere in the map. Now, in the last scenario, the game isn't able to spawn the player anywhere in a 1-connection node or in a 2-connection node. Neither of those are available. And what then happens is that both the player and the core are spawned in random locations. Now, I think this theory allows us to be more precise in our definitions, and I would like to call these two scenarios mid spawns. So when the randomness of the core spawning happens because of the lack of eligible nodes, those are called mid spawns from now on. And whenever there is no eligible spawn for the player to begin with, we will call it forced spawns. So what you will need to understand when you go about hacking is the relative rarity of these scenarios. So what happens how often? And I put some percentages next to them. So what you should immediately notice is that most of the hacks, here 65% and 34%, are where the core is actually 8 nodes away from the player. Now, in 1% of the cases, the core is not 8 nodes away because the core was spawned in randomly. Now, you might remember a figure of 3% from the last video. I've had to reclassify 2 hacks from that video as now not being mid spawns anymore. So this number has gone down even further. Then, exceedingly rare, we have the situation where you spawn in a 2-connection node in the middle of the map. And lastly, the situations, right, we're talking about 1 in 1,000, there where the game spawns both the player and the core in random nodes. Now that you know how rare everything is, what can you really take from this for your own hacks? Well, if you spawn in one of these 4 nodes, you're guaranteed to have a mid spawn. The core will be spawned in randomly, and it can be anywhere. Secondly, we've seen some cases where in those lighter blue nodes, you can also have a mid spawn. However, it's not confirmed, and if you have one of those nodes, I'd love to see it. So we can make this map consequently, where we have a little bit more security. I removed some of the question marks relative to the previous video. However, it's still a bit uncertain. Lastly, when your spawn has more than 2 connections, you can also be sure that the core can spawn anywhere. I would like to use this last part of the video to ask you guys for help in 3 ways. First of all, please send me any theories or data that you might have. You can reach me on YouTube, Reddit, or Eve. Second, this is still my 2nd video, so please comment me any feedback, especially was the audio any better. And lastly, thank you for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe. Fly dangerous.